So as we approach the end of the course, we have another great, not terribly well-known movie called Shadow of the Vampire. This was another one, if I had mentioned this before, of my 30 DVDs for 30 days. And it was a surprisingly good movie. I knew nothing about it before renting it, and everyone that I've shown it to or recommended it to has been pretty much impressed with it. But there are some key things that you need to know about this movie that many audiences may not have been aware of in watching it. So a couple of familiar faces, people that you may recognize from our other films. So we have Cary Ellis, played Lord Arthur Holmwood in Dracula. You may recognize him from that. And as I mentioned, Udo Kier, who was Dragonetti in Blade, also pops up in this movie and has played Dracula once himself. Murnau is played by John Malkovich. So if you recognize John Malkovich, there he is. He's probably most well known for a movie called Being John Malkovich. Very trippy movie. Certainly worth watching, but you might have to watch it a couple of times. It's really, really out there. He was also in a Coen Brothers movie called Burn After Reading. He was in both of the Red movies, if you've seen either of those. And some of the movies that he's probably not as well known for, though I think they're both worth watching. A film called Color Me Kubrick, which was kind of a biopic on someone who pretended to be Stanley Kubrick. I thought that was a particularly interesting and worthwhile film. And then if you saw Warm Bodies, which is a relatively recent film, he was in there as well, not in a major role, but both of those movies are kind of indie movies, and certainly I would argue worth watching. And the Red movies were fine for what they were, action movies, and the Coen Brothers movie is good, Burn After Reading, as is Being John Malkovich. So what you may not know is that Max Schreck there was an urban legend that said that he really was a vampire, that's why he was so good at playing that character. Of course, that's not true, but there is a whole mythology that was built around that, suggesting that Shrek really was a vampire. And it's not entirely clear at the end of this film whether the film is suggesting that Shrek was in fact deeply disturbed or was really a vampire. It's hard to tell in this film. I mean, certainly we'll see his demise at the end of the film, but it's not entirely clear that that's how real that is and how much of that is really what Shrek believed. Of course, none of this is true. This is not a biography. This is not based on fact. It is kind of an artistic interpretation of what many would argue is an urban legend. So we have some shots in Shadow of the Vampire that I would argue are iconic images from Nosferatu, and these are shots from Shadow of the Vampire. Though I would argue that this one in particular, the Wismar one, is probably just lifted from Nosferatu. I don't think they went back and reshot this. If they did a very excellent job of making it look like it was the original. But I actually think that is a shot from the original. The other two are William Dafoe as Shrek, as is this one as well. So these are not the upper two and lower right images are from Shadow of the Vampire. The other one on the lower left is from Shadow of the Vampire, but I would argue came from Nosferatu. But these are pretty iconic images, and in fact, some of these same screenshots I showed you when we went through Nosferatu. So these are pretty recognizable screenshots that people that know Nosferatu would see them and go, wow, that is an excellent reproduction of a shot from Nosferatu. There are some scenes that are performed in this film, more than just even shots, that again harken back to Nosferatu, whether he's reading the book in the hotel room or the inn, I guess, whether it's at the dinner scene or the contract signing scene. So they are performing a performance, which in its own way is kind of peculiar, right? They're pretending to be people, pretending to be other people in another film. So there's a faithfulness to the original that's really necessary here for it to make sense. Now we'll talk in a little bit what happens if you don't know the original. And I would argue that if you did not know Nosferatu, your interpretation of this film and your enjoyment of this film is different than someone who did know Nosferatu, which is a challenge making a movie like this. How much of it do you want to invest in audiences that have not seen the original? How much do you want to fill in for them? And how much do you want to sort of allude to something that you're sure the audience has seen? So these are three scenes in particular that I thought were very well done. And if you saw them side by side with the original Nosferatu, you would recognize them even more and probably appreciate the performance even a little bit more. So we have, once again, an establishing shot. So we don't have many films where this has not happened. And again, there is a consciousness in this film of the silent film era. So that this is supposed to, in addition to being an establishing shot, also a connection to silent films. So so it's kind of serving a dual purpose. So there are several moments in this film where we see kind of the typical characteristics of a vampire film, narrative techniques, motifs, if you will, that let us know we're in a vampire film. So we see someone get bit by a vampire. That's something we're quite used to. We see Max not cast a reflection, and you see how that disturbs Greta. That is probably the best sign that he is really a vampire. All the other evidence is kind of suspect. It's not entirely clear that he's a vampire or just disturbed, but not casting a reflection is a pretty hard thing to do, even if you are disturbed. So is that a sign that he is really a vampire? I don't know. But that is certainly something we've seen in other vampire films. We see the stake as a weapon, and we see him recoil a little bit when he sees that. So that's another technique of the vampire narrative. And of course, we see him destroyed by sunlight at the end. So vampires don't like sunlight. And what's been interesting in some of the films up until this point, we've seen the ways in which some of these techniques appear in the film, and in others they do not. So whether or not a vampire actually casts a reflection has been a subject of debate. Sunlight destroying a vampire has been not universal in these films. So, but we still recognize them. We recognize them as the central techniques of vampire films narratives. Like Nosferatu, the film that they're supposed to be making in Shadow of the Vampire, Shadow of the Vampire plays a lot with light and shadows and focus. And I think this scene is a particularly good example of the way in which light sources and shadows are played with. This is, of course, the vampire entrance. So this is our first shot of the vampire. And you can see, I mean, just in this screenshot alone, there are lots of shadows that you can see. And they really do create a kind of sense of impending doom, if you will. So light and shadows and focus are as prominent in a film about a film as they were in the film that they're supposed to be making, if that makes sense. And I always enjoy a movie that involves movie making, because that, you know, they often talk about making a movie while you're watching a movie, and that's always interesting. Much like that tracking shot that I showed you from The Player, they're talking about a tracking shot in Touch of Evil while they're doing a tracking shot. So people that are paying attention get that, and that's part of the enjoyment of watching the movie. So in chapter 1, Prince talks quite a bit about focal length and depth of field and lenses. So in this shot, you can see that the background is out of focus and the foreground is in focus. And you can change that quickly through lens techniques and camera techniques, where you can put the foreground out of focus and the background in focus. And what Prince says that techniques like that sort of suggest movement where there is none. Hitchcock came up with several techniques that allowed him to use the camera to create movement. And one of the ways to do that is to change where the camera is focusing on. So for focus and lenses in chapter 1, Prince has a pretty lengthy discussion. And as I said, shifting the focus from one object to another can mimic movement. Prince talks about 4 kinds of lenses: a normal lens, a telephoto lens, a wide angle lens, and a zoom lens. And it's important to know the examples that Prince gives for each of those, when you would use each of those lenses, why you would use each of those lenses, and what they perform differently in terms of narrative and in terms of filmmaking. So that's, I won't get into everything that he talks about there, but I would go back and read that again to make sure that you understand how he says cameras utilize different kinds of lenses. Prince also discusses international filmmaking and international films in chapter 10. So what he says is that U.S. cinema influences foreign directors in a variety of ways, one of which is foreign directors need to be conscious of American films and often position their films relative to U.S. productions. And that's not something that has always existed, but it is very much a norm now. Now, it's not everywhere, but in a variety of films that you can see that are from foreign countries, you can see the American influence in them. Often foreign directors will come to the United States and become a part of the U.S. film industry, and that's important, and that has existed for as long as film has existed. And how they bring their foreign perspective to influence American films is one way that U.S. cinema and international cinema interact. And then, of course, there's the remaking of foreign films and distributing them overseas. So you may not know it every time you see it when a film you're watching was a remake of a foreign film. And often those films make it back to the countries where the original was made. So you can think of several different kinds of foreign films, whether it's Japanese horror or European action films. We'll reinterpret them and send them back over, and those audiences will watch them again. Our industry, our film industry, attracts a great deal of overseas talent, in part because our film industry is a much bigger film industry. There's a lot more money to be made in the U.S. film industry on the production side than there is overseas. The distribution side is that a lot of overseas distribution is where money is made when you release a film. So a film could not do very well in the US market, but make its money back in the foreign market. So it's kind of an inversion. Foreign filmmakers don't do as well making money overseas as part of the production, but US filmmakers will make more money sometimes when their films are released overseas. And as I just mentioned, Hollywood loves to do remakes of foreign films. You'll often find television shows are often adapted from European, sometimes England in particular, especially when you're talking about reality shows. Many of the reality shows that we've come to enjoy and love are actually just remakes of foreign reality shows. And again, the US version often is more popular and sometimes makes its way back over. But there are European action and drama films that we've remade in the US, and there are Japanese horror films that have been remade. As someone that watches and studies reality television, I've had a particularly hard time watching the original British versions of some of these reality shows. There was a show on A&E called Airline that focused on Southwest Airlines in airports across the country, and there was a British version of it taking place in British airports. And every time I watched it, it just felt to me like I was watching a scripted show, a drama, and I couldn't take it seriously, if you can take any reality TV seriously. So for me, that kind of threw me as an American audience, and that was reality television. But you'll find that, especially when we remake Japanese horror films in the United States, Japanese horror films are way more arty and way more ambiguous in Japan than they are when they're remade here. And sometimes our attempt to make them make sense for an American audience really does undercut the art factor of the original. So just something to keep in mind when you see an American remake of a Japanese horror film. So in the article that we read by Gardiner, there is a pretty detailed argument about the way in which Jewish culture was associated with vampires in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. So this is not a novel argument. This is something that has been well documented. Um, it was a way to juxtapose, for lack of a better term, what people at the time would have viewed as kind of good, pure Christianity against everything else, not just Judaism, but anything that was different. But the the Jewish culture being connected to the vampire was something that was done a little more explicitly. And the examples that are in this article are pretty interesting. So, the idea that the male, a Jewish male, was cold, feminine, evil, calculating, and starving for warm blood was imagery that was used in literature throughout the time. So the vampire was an example of that, but you could have said all those things without actually saying the word vampire, and these were the images that would have been brought to mind. Murnau's vampire is an exaggeration of Stoker's Dracula and has many of those characteristics. There are exaggerated physical and physiological traits in both Stoker and Murnau's Nosferatu that, again, for many audiences would have signaled that kind of difference, the difference in non-Christianity. We've already talked about vampires having kind of a lack of religion, if you will, and being afraid of religion. I mean, that's why the cross is a weapon. But there were many anti-Semitic undertones to the vampire narrative. So what Gardner, the example that Gardner gives is that there was this Aristotelian inversion. So that what Gardner is referring to is that the female was the inversion, the opposite, if you will, of the male. And that's what that Aristotelian logic posited. So if the male was good and pure, the female was impure and evil. And they were not medical studies. This is part of the problem here is philosophy was standing in as medicine. So the female body was seen as polluted as a part of kind of the natural processes that female bodies go through, and that was seen as being unpure or unclean, and that was problematic in that Aristotelian logic, even though Aristotelian philosophy wasn't based at all on science. If you look at the way Orlok is depicted, he is the opposite of the warm Christian male in Nosferatu. In many ways, in literature and imagery, Jewish men were feminized. So if Jewish men were associated with an impure female body, that allowed, in that Aristotelian logic, to position them against pure Christian males. And again, just to reemphasize, the Aristotelian logic is very philosophical. It's not based on medicine, and modern medicine, certainly debunked a lot of those really anti-Semitic and horribly closed-minded views of masculinity and femininity, Christianity and non-Christianity, and the vampire was just one stand-in for that kind of anti-Semitism. Many people considered Bram Stoker to be anti-Semitic in his writings and in what he had said throughout the course of his life. So part of that is read into Dracula as well. If you need to see examples of imagery associating Jews with vampires or monsters, many of them come from Nazi Germany. So you can see newspaper caricatures, you can see comics, you can see, again, caricatures in print. This is a actual newspaper article. and books. So there were a whole bunch of imagery in Nazi Germany that positioned Jews and Jewish people as monsters, and often vampires, but usually monsters of just about any kind. So, what are the key takeaways from Shadow of the Vampire? Well, uh, certainly this is not a remake of Nosferatu, but for many audiences, knowing Nosferatu is an important aspect of enjoying a film like Shadow of the Vampire. There is an element of foreign filmmaking here. Um, so it has that kind of foreign sensibility, and certainly they are in a foreign country when making this film. Even they are coming from a country that is foreign to us and going to a country that is foreign to them. So it is foreign in a great many ways, both from our perspective as audiences and within the narrative of the film. Uh, Go back and reread what Prince says about lenses and see how he applies it in the textbook, but also think about how it's applied in this particular film and the films that we have left. And it's just important to remember that the vampire narrative has some anti-Semitic undertones to it. Those date back to medieval times, so they are very old. They predate the modern vampire narrative, and they were appropriated in many ways in Nazi propaganda that employed in its negative portrayal of Jews the vampire or monstrous imagery.